year 2025 marked a turning point in the political histories of both Europe and the United States of America. Undoubtedly, the return of President Donald Trump to the White House opened a new chapter in global politics, one that has reshaped political vectors not only in the Middle East across Asian countries, but also in Europe itself. What is particularly striking is, however, is how Trump positioned the new administration in direct contrast to the predecessors, implicitly acknowledging the dangers of prior U.S. foreign policy. Yet one cannot but can question the sincerity of this supposed reckoning. After all, Trump's first term in office hardly less controversial than the leadership he now criticizes. To delve deeper into this paradox and unpack the implications of Trump's second-term foreign policy narrative, we are joined by Professor Frank Musmar from the state of Texas. He's a guest of our Baku Networks. Welcome, Professor.
Welcome. Thank you.
As you are aware, President Donald Trump made a high-profile visit to Riyadh last Wednesday, during which he made several noteworthy admissions. He harshly criticized previous U.S. administrations for their military interventions in the Middle East, accusing them of nation-destroying under the guise of nation-building. Among the countries he cited were Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and others. Interestingly, Trump also referenced the historical cases of Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, Panama, Grenada, and Yugoslavia, arguing that all of them, in his words, had filled the boots, tanks, and fighter jets of the Pentagon. Now the question is, do you believe these admissions reflect genuine remorse or a strategic pivot? So if so, what might explain Trump's newfound candor or frankness, let's say, and overt criticism to his predecessors?
Well, thanks. First, thanks for hosting me. I appreciate that. If we want to discuss the character of Donald Trump and the character of U.S. diplomatic missions, there is a big difference, and we have to consider that. Trump is a pragmatic man. He combined two dimensions, the business and politics. The first term, I'm not going to count on it too much because it was his first term, his first experiences in politics. I see now this term more mature. He developed that character of his own expressions as a Donald Trump into a MAGA movement. So now we cannot just imply everything that he say or express as Donald Trump. It is MAGA movement now in the United States. It's more than one person, which is Donald Trump, represented by Donald Trump. But once we compare the character of Donald Trump to any predecessors, the idea is this guy combined two dimensions, which is politics and business. So for business people, normally they look at results. And the results from all those criticism that he mentioned was negative, obviously negative. So as an example, he mentioned Iraq, and he mentioned, beside the point, he disagreed on the point of opinions of some people about Saddam Hussein, and he agreed at the point that he was a dictator, but in the meantime, he was saying that Iraq was better off during Saddam Hussein than now. And why now? Because he's looking at the results. For the time and the money that we spend as the United States in Iraq, it become as a hub of terrorists, and we handed intentionally or unintentionally Iraq to Iran. So his point of criticizing, as an example, George W. Bush move into Iraq was from that dimension. And at the beginning, we, like in the United States, we were at the motives of going to Iraq because Iraq has nuclear weapons and then or mass destructions or whatever it is. And it's been proven afterwards that he does not have anything. So even the motives of going to Iraq was false flag, which is, is very easy to criticize, but his criticism was from the results. And we take that point to Afghanistan as well. As long as we spend that much money and time in Afghanistan, our withdrawal from Afghanistan was out of zero results. Like we left the country without a control out of the United States. And in the meantime, we lost all those equipments and money that we spent there. Of course, our soldiers that died and crippled, and we have so many veterans now that, suffer in health issues and all that kind of stuff. So from that point, we add that dimension to Donald Trump that he looks like what we gain as a United States out of those wars. And of course, he mentioned Libya as well, and he mentioned Muammar Gaddafi as well. Libya during Muammar Gaddafi, beside the point he was dictator or not, but it was a better off than now. The country is divided with a civil war, and actually we lost as the United States our ambassador there in a terror act. So his criticism comes from the results. Now, at the end, all politicians, what they do, they play with their budget. So, as an example, this year we have a budget. Eventually, next year we're gonna have a budget. So, the budget this year, maybe let's say a trillion, as an example, for the Department of Defense. So, diplomatic people normally they utilize that budget, and then whatever left out of it, whatever happened, how it's been used or not, with the results or not, it's been part of the budget and it's been used. So, the second year we're gonna have another budget and so forth. But for Donald Trump, he looked at it from the point of a businessman. Even though we spend it, and next year we're going to have another budget, but what did we gain out of that expenditures? So from that point, he criticized his predecessor. He doesn't criticize them at a personal level. He criticized their actions and how those moves that they did wars-wise wasn't really with a benefit to the United States. Second point, like related to Donald Trump, he always promote himself as a peace guy. He doesn't want to have problems. He doesn't want to have wars. And he believed with his ability as a businessman that he could solve problems at a round table. He believes that there is a deal, and he claimed all the time that he is a deal maker. And if you look at his expressions nowadays, talking about Ukraine and talking about Russia, he's trying to make a deal more than a war. So he always kind of have that pride in himself that I could solve problems if you give it to me on a round table more than just going with people, foot on the ground, and we lose people, we lose lives, and all that. And if you remember all his quotes, all the time he say that there is at least 5,000 people dies at the weekly level between Russia, both from both parts, between Russia and Ukraine. So he's talking about here a humanitarian issue more than just being a war or conflict with whoever is the right or wrong at that kind of conflict. So promoting himself as a peacemaker, he would like to solve these problems from an economic perspective. If we want to take that point all the way to Saudi Arabia, as you start your sentence, now, like the previous administration, Biden administration, had a bad relationship with the Gulf states in general. Of course, most notably was Saudi Arabia. And the biggest problem was direct attack from the government to the personality and actions of MBS, or the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. That, of course, created a kind of friction between Saudi Arabia and the United States, and in the meantime, created an atmosphere for those countries to go towards our competition, which is China. Now, at the end, the United States at this moment, it's in really like not actual war, but we are in a war with China in an economic perspective.
Oh,
And it's not
Dear Professor, we'll
go ahead,
come
go ahead.
back to the questions later now. But
Okay.
the focus is that actually that Donald Trump's first presidential term was completely different. As you remember that just nearly the end of this first term was like finalized with the striking the Iranians general, let's say. So the Donald Trump's stance towards Middle East and especially Iran was quite aggressive, as we know it. But later in the second term, he changed his stance. He became quite soft, and his war changed, the strategy changed towards shifting into the economical war right now. So that's the question now, because previously Donald Trump, if you remember that from his move, that we saw completely different move from Donald Trump. Right now we're seeing completely different. Now he is showing off that he even said, Trump repeatedly asserted that he says wars are utterly counterproductive, and he says that the peace is the only rational path forward, and European leaders, however, have openly criticized this stance, particularly in relation to the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict, because European leaders, most of them are really pushing the Ukraine towards the continuing the war and ending this war in favor of Ukraine. But now we see completely different approach to this relationship. And as you know, recently Donald Trump had a phone call with President Putin, and many critics, many experts, they really criticize this because they think it quite useless talks on the phone. And in your view, can Trump's approach to resolving the Russia-Ukraine war be considered globally viable or diplomatic sound?
Well, now, if you allow me a small comment, we have to distinguish between the first term and the second term of Donald Trump. We have to. The first term was Donald Trump, the one that was an outsider to the politics circle in the United States, and most of his advisors was hired, but by Washington, by like the circle of politicians in Washington. And if you remember, like after 6 months, he stopped firing and rehiring and all that. So he was like kind of an outsider to that kind of circle. And now, as we said, he's not even Donald Trump by himself. He's the expert Donald Trump plus MAGA movement. If you remember, at the beginning, he hired all those people that they were hard and harsh supporters for him and criticizing the other part. And actually, he was very successful in absorbing some of the other part as well. Like, we got like Tulsi Gabbard, we got Kennedy, and they were like, kind of stars at the Democratic Party as well. So we cannot compare between the first Trump and the second Trump, between the first two terms. Now, every time Donald Trump, he inherits something from the previous administration. And I like to concentrate all the time on what he says, and then I analyze his character. So he always claimed that this war is not mine. I inherited this war, as an example. And I would like to have a solution out of my point of view, out of my own vision to it, not just to keep going with the previous administration. And this is what happened to him. Same thing, like in the first term. Like he's not the one that he made the deal with Iraq. It was Obama, and then he came and he canceled that. So to answer your question, how can Trump apply his vision to the solution of the war? We have to understand that Russia has demands and Ukraine has demands. And Donald Trump, as we said, he's a deal maker. The problem of the European Union, they don't understand that the life nowadays is totally 100% different than the life after the Second World War. And they don't understand the difference between Russia and the Soviet Union. So these kind of things, it took it time over the years, and now there is a need to change it. And the need is happening during Donald Trump's time, plus his ambition to solve the problems in a different way using his own vision. So it's a combination of so many factors. If we look at this war, the most loser or the biggest loser of this war is the European Union. To be honest with you, life is very expensive now in Europe. They have the problem and dependency on Russia's gas and oil, and the other option will be for them it's the United States oil. So at the end, they are looking at their benefits, a depleted country, economy, military, and they never invested in anything after the Second World War more than reliance on the United States. So to them, they are inflamed and they are always alert in any communication between the United States and Putin, because to them, definitely any concession to Russia is going to be on their account. Now, we cannot solve those problems without concession to Russia because Russia had demands as well. And if there is a demand, is going to be applied or in concession to Russia, definitely the Europeans is going to use it against Trump as it happens because of a personal relationship between Donald Trump and Putin, which is not correct. Because at the end, if Ukraine has demand and Russia has demand, you're going to have to meet somehow some middle point. And that's what he said. He said, if you don't want me to interfere, then you solve the problem at your own pace. You solve it in the Vatican, you solve it in Europe, you do whatever you want. In the meantime, the European Union are very limited in their resources and their military supplies, and they have harsh demands that impossible Russia is going to accept. One of them is there is no NATO at the borders of Russia. And the European Union are insistent in Ukraine to be somehow, today or in the future, as a member of the NATO. So if, as an example, Trump, just to solve this problem quickly, he will come and give concession to Russia, saying that there is no NATO Ukraine, they're going to take it against Trump that he gave concession to Russia. But the idea is at the ground now, the strongest person in the ground now is Putin. And I said from day one, however is gonna the bottle, how is gonna look like after a certain period of time, and we have now 3 years of war. The strongest on the ground is the strongest on a negotiation table. And to be realistic, Russia is the strongest on the negotiation table now.
Well, out of topic, I want to just ask a question about, especially the Donald Trump's previously mentioning the sanctions that he said before, and he said he would present new sanctions towards Russia. But now on the table we see no sanctions, and even though European leaders now are very assertive about this, they just push even the American side that the sanctions will come to be realized over Russia now. But what about the sanctions that America is really thinking about this? Do you think that in future there might be several tough sanctions from Donald Trump if the negotiations wouldn't go to the successful side? We know because in Istanbul, the previous one, the latest negotiations that the Ukraine and Russian sides they came together, it was not successful. But what's the next step now from American side, from the United States, America? You think?
Well, just to comment on that point, sanctions does not work with Russia. Could work with any other country, but does not work with Russia. Up to date, the European Union is still dependent on the gas and oil from Russia. Up to date.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we're talking about a war, and we're talking about all these frictions between the European Union, Ukraine, and Russia, but they're still reliant and they're still dependent on the gas and oil of Russia. Up to date. So let's be realistic here. 3 years of sanctions against Russia did not work. Russia is well set to handle that.
Mm-hmm.
Second, the history proves that. Germany, Hitler, Napoleon, France, it did not work. Sanctions and invasion of Russia doesn't. History proves that. Okay, so from my opinion, the European Union has to be more realistic here and reduce their demands somehow. There is no magic here. At the end, European Union. I have to say something here, like which is like maybe related or somehow irrelated, but it might clarify the point.
I would like the context to be mainly focused on also Ukraine side, because the Ukraine is the main side that is losing its part of its lands, and Ukraine is not really on the side of making a concession to the Russian side. Maybe he's right. Volodymyr Zelensky is right about that. He says he's quite skeptic about Russia's approach into the peace, because Russia wants to, reinforce his power, maybe to restore his power and to come back again and to reserve the lands of Ukraine. And that's why Ukrainian side is really assertive about just carrying on the war. But what if Ukrainian side is not really compromising this? What's going to happen if European sides are back and Ukraine I want to carry out this war myself? And what do you think it might happen? Or do you think if Europe just sees as helping the Ukrainian side, that would end the war and would just bring the peace negotiations close to the table?
Well, now, if we want to explain this point, we have to understand the entire factors and the entire players in this game. This war is not Ukraine war. This is the European Union war towards Russia. Ukraine cannot fight Russia. Let's just be
Yes,
realistic.
literally, it's like
And
that.
definitely. And why I told you, I just want to highlight a point because the European Union now is not Europe after the Second World War. It's totally different. And these countries never invested in their military abilities and even recruiting. The recruiting rate in England is horrible. So can they really back up Ukraine, even though that they are the one backing up now Ukraine and asking Ukraine to keep going with the war? They really cannot. In the meantime, there is a kind of friction of the relationship between the United States and Europe on the subject of the NATO, because the NATO has been carried on the shoulders of the United States, economy, soldiers, and all that for a long time. And that was necessary after the Second World War because of the Soviet Union. But now we don't have Soviet Union. Second, we have now what's called European Union with an economy and euro that is competing with the dollar. So what we have now is not what we have after the Second World War. So if we want to be realistic here, can Ukraine be by itself? Impossible. Is the European Union has the ability to back up Ukraine? Impossible. That's why they are very skeptic and they look at every move from the United States because without the United States, neither Europe, neither Ukraine can sustain or can stand against Russia. Impossible. And we know that, and it's a fact. Now, from that point, the United States is not willing to extend this war because it is like being NATO part or being economy part, it's on the shoulders of the United States, and we are in the United States now under too much of trillions of dollars of debts. And we have a leader that he has a background as a businessman. So he look at it as a loss. And he doesn't want to keep going with that. Plus, of course, that humanitarian part that he doesn't want those 5,000 people, as he mentioned, that dying on a weekly basis. So the problem is Europe and Ukraine are making Donald Trump decisions. Looks like it is personal decisions with Putin, which is not true. It is actually the strategical benefits of the United States. Something else, the United States used to have good relationship with Russia, the global affairs, not just at Ukrainians level. And we lost all those communications in the last 3 years because of the sanctions, and we don't have for 3 years diplomatic missions. Now we start having it back. Why? It's important because it's important for the Middle East. It's important for Asia, China, Africa. So the United States cannot just cut its relationship 100% with Russia for the global affairs and for the strategical benefits of the United States for the sake of Ukraine and European unions.
Well,
Does that make sense?
yeah, yes, it does. And also, I would like to touch on the issue, a main issue, that because we discussed the main problem that is on the other side of the world. But now, I want to just go a little bit far, to China, to the Far East, because there was also tension between U.S. and China, as you remember, and Donald Trump started with a tough tariff issue. We remember this, as you know, the protracted tariff dispute has recently de-escalated following the mutual agreement now. So nevertheless, several financial institutions and market analysts have interpreted this outcome as a capitulation of Donald Trump's part, And would you think Trump initially adopted such a hardline position only to soften it so abruptly? So what were the underlying strategic calculations?
Well, Donald Trump has a tactic that he likes to use. He likes to shoot to the highest level, and then he negotiates. And we see that like at so many levels. So yeah, he could shoot like the tariffs with China, as what he did, to 145 or something. He could shoot it to 1,000 maybe. And then he opened the door for negotiations. But the idea with China is so many complicated, and a lot of people don't understand it. China is not just China's supply chain, which is well known to people. And people think that, okay, well, it's a competition between the two supply chains and who win the war of economy and who's the biggest economy and all that. China used so many supply chains. That's why Trump, he targeted so many countries in a hemisphere of China because China used those countries for their supply chain. In the meantime, China used for the last good 50 years sort of small financial gap in a financial system in the United States. It's called the de minimis, which is like a small soft gap that allow countries like China and Asian countries use what they call in their language parcel, but we call it de minimis in the United States, which is actually grow up to a point in the last 2 years to $66 billion a year of trade. This de minimis law or gap, once it came to existence, was to allow small products not to be maximum of more than after max more than $80 per package. But China used it as a business, and we have so many businesses in the United States for like called dollar stores and like cheapy kind of products. They use that to skip all kind of taxes and tariffs products that come into the United States. And that was the main reason for Trump attacking all those countries with tariffs to cut those supply chains that China used. And to be honest with you, China got squeezed. And we see, negotiations that happen in Switzerland because China understand that it's not like before. And now we're going to have to set some standards. At the beginning, we're going to say maybe in the light terms of expressions that there is a war between Trump and China. And this is not really fair because if we want to say, from an economic perspective, there is a war between the United States and China, not Trump and China. Trump at the end representing the United States. And I don't want you to understand I'm defending Donald Trump. But when you're talking about $66 billion of gas used by China, used by its own supply chain, and this comes to the United States for zero tariffs or zero tax, that's a whole invasion of the United States. Now, second, we don't have any trade agreement with China. The only trade agreement that the only agreement that we have with China is the double taxation of double citizenship that we have in between, like China and the United States. If I have double citizenship, I'm Chinese American, so I just pay taxes in one of them countries. That's the only trade, business, taxes, whatever it is, deal between us and China. We don't have any agreements. And China did not sign nearly half of the international agreements, especially trades and all that. So what Donald Trump is trying to do is to push China to accept like more concessions, more global agreements, more trade agreements, and to cut all those small de minimis that consider gaps that China supply chain is using. Now, something very important: China came with what's called the new Silk Road that China is trying to build. And if Donald Trump is not going to interfere in that and build sort of good relationship in the Middle East, because that line has to go through the Middle East and go to Europe somehow. So that is going to kill the United States. That's the economy is done here. So China has an ambition. United States has an ambition, and at the end, I think it was fair to push China to come to the table and negotiate. I think so.
Thank you so much for sharing your valuable views. Thank you for joining us, Professor.
Well, I hope I clear the points for you.
Thank you
Did
very
I?
much. That was quite interesting, and I hope that the time was quite well. We organized. We did it in an organized manner. And okay,
But hopefully I answered your question. Did I?
yes, it's all
Hopefully I
questions.
answered. Yes.
Yeah, you were.
Mm.
You could answer all the questions, and it was quite well. So we found probably the better answers for all the questions that was really, dazzling in the mind. So it's all okay. And again, I'm thankful to you for joining us and sharing your valuable
Thank you.
views with us.
Anytime.
Thank you. Bye. We had a guest from the United States of America, Professor Frank Musmar, discussing the United States of America's policy, Donald Trump, and his policy towards Europe, Ukraine, Russia crisis, and China.